Welcome to Reinvent and the series Reinvent the Humanities to Change the World, done in partnership with Georgetown University. This is one of a series of a dozen interviews we're doing with people inside academia, outside academia, who are really talking about the role of the humanities and actually the practical role of the humanities going forward in the coming decades. And today we've got an interesting interview with Soraya Darabi, who is the co-founder of an interesting company called Zaidi, although she's just recently moved on to, apparently is going to be founding some other companies here. But Zaidi is considered the kind of the Whole Foods of fashion, which we'll talk to her a little bit later. But she's essentially been a serial entrepreneur, and she can talk a little bit about that. And she got her roots at the New York Times, working in their kind of social media and kind of the new media kind of world of I guess the manager of digital partnerships and social media marketing at the New York Times to start off before she started doing her entrepreneurial side. It's great to have you here, Soraya, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter.
Well, as folks know here, we're actually really interested in just hearing the stories of folks, successful folks like yourself, a little bit about their own roots in the humanities. My understanding is your undergrad, you did kind of immerse in the humanities, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit of your story kind of coming from that point on, a little bit about what's your relationship to the humanities.
I'd be happy to. So first and foremost, I am a Hoya. I graduated from Georgetown College in 2005. And while at Georgetown, initially majored in English, really enjoyed my time studying journalism there, and then fell in love my senior year with art history, mainly thanks to Elizabeth Pralinger and her modern art history classes at Georgetown. And so absolutely, I studied the humanities and don't regret that for a second. I'm the daughter of academics, and I remember going into college, I asked my mother, a public policy professor, what I should study. And she said, the beauty of college is that you should study whatever interests you, and you should worry about your future later. Now, depending on to whom you speak, that's either the best advice or the worst advice, but I'm going to reflect positively and say it was the best advice I was ever given.
Well, give us a sense of why was it the best advice ever given? I'd be curious.
I actually typically give college students the advice that you should study what interests you and you should follow your passions academically, but go to a school in a city so you can pursue internships to learn practical skills. That's precisely what I did at Georgetown. You know, I studied English literature and journalism, but used opportunities to work for Sony Music and the WashingtonPost.com to get my footing into the worlds of marketing and journalism. And when I was applying for jobs in New York City 2 days after my college graduation date, it helped to have those landmark names on my resume. But when it comes to actually pursuing what you're interested in and thinking back on the classes I took at Georgetown, I don't regret for a moment that I didn't bulk up on economics-laden courses or courses more focused on tangible trade skills, because I think having a deep passion for the humanities made me a more well-rounded human being, much more intellectual, and in a way, everything comes full circle again. Having a deep interest in the humanities has served me very well in business.
That's interesting. So, well, actually, I'd love to hear how it served you well in business, but maybe give us, just given I gave a little simple intro there, but why don't you just give us a little background on your kind of trajectory to get into where you are now and how you position yourself, and then let's talk a little bit about how it played in your career there.
I'd be happy to talk about my career. My career, like many, is not particularly linear, although it makes complete sense to me. At age 13, I had my first job at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I grew up. And the Guthrie is a theater that focuses on Shakespearean classics mostly. And so there, I developed a love for literature and for plays and for the spoken word in addition to the written word. Fast forward to Georgetown, as I mentioned, I studied art and literature, but used my opportunity to be a student of the city to get out and go to shows. It was at the 930 Club where a representative for Sony Music, an employee out of the New York office, noticed me and said, "I've seen you at these venues before. Sometimes I'd go to those shows by myself." He said, "Would you like to work for Sony?" So I applied to be a college marketing rep, and while at Georgetown, worked almost full-time for Sony, setting up meet and greets for particular artists and promoting Columbia Epic and Legacy record artists on Georgetown campus, but also on the campuses of GW, American University, and Howard University. And it was there that I became fascinated with demographics. And this doesn't actually have a lot to do with humanities, and yet it does. It was a passion for music that led to a job, but that job led to an interest. And the interest was trying to understand why certain people liked particular types of musicians. So why was Nas or Bone Thugs and Harmony so popular on Howard University campus, but not at all popular on Georgetown campus, where Howie Day and John Mayer were performing much better? And you can make assumptions drawing along the racial divide, but actually the demographics proved to be much more fascinating. And while I was at Sony, I remember writing a letter, an email to my boss there, complaining that all of my friends were downloading music on Napster and LimeWire. I couldn't understand why we were receiving physical CDs in the mail to distribute to college radio stations, which nobody were listening to. I'm sorry, WGTB, it's a great station, but nobody was listening to WGTB. We were streaming music online. And the answer was sort of a nice pat on the head, that's adorable, but continue to do your day job. And so it was a professor at Georgetown who actually inspired me. Barbara Feynman is her name. I hope she's still there. She was a reporter for the Washington Post, and she said, you know, with your interest in digital, you should get an internship at thewashingtonpost.com. And so there, my senior year, I worked across 2 semesters teaching journalists how to use the digital tools that I, as a digital native, grew up with. So again, it was that passion for music and the arts and humanity that led me to the internet to be a web geek. And at thewashingtonpost.com, I taught journalists how to use very simple tools that were native to me, like RSS, Real Simple Syndication. I would teach them how to hyperlink, to link out their articles to other reporters in hopes of getting links back, which was marketing. And that experience led to my first job in New York. So I moved to New York City right after college, and like so many others of the baby boomer second generation, had trouble getting a job right out of the gate. And that surprised me. I got great grades in college. I had amazing internships. I thought people would just hand me a beautiful job on a silver platter. I mainly hung out on my sister's rooftop drinking wine with a fellow Georgetown grad that summer, and I applied to 303 jobs in 3 months. And I remember the number because when I finally got a job at Condé Nast, at VNU Media was my first job, I went back and I counted the applications that I put out in email. It's a shocking number. And ultimately, I began writing for VNU publications like Backstage newspaper and magazine. It's a theater newspaper, and Billboard magazine about music. So everything comes full circle. My first internship was at a theater. My first job was for a music company, and then I'm studying journalism in college and writing about it. But the problem about journalism is that it doesn't pay you anything. And I wanted health benefits, and I wanted to be able to go to dinner with my friends on a Friday night. And so less than a year later, I sent an application to the head of HR at Condé Nast, who was Rob Schul at the time, really lovely man. I was applying to be David Remnick's assistant at the New Yorker, and he brought me in for the interview, and he said, you know, your resume looks great, and if you want the job, you have it, just so you know, but I'm going to tell you, this job pays $28,000 a year and does not offer health benefits. And I was really upset. He said, but I have something else in mind for you. He said, I saw under interests in your resume, you listed reading blogs. And I said, yes, I wrote that to be cheeky. You know, I spend way too much time reading blogs online. He said, why don't you consider working for Condé Nast, the digital division of Condé Nast? I think you'd be right at home there. And he was right. I took the job, which paid $5,000 more with health benefits, and that led to everything good that's happened to me in my career since. The David Remnick job would have been more prestigious and would have made my grandparents so happy, but truthfully, I'm a web geek, and it was in that role at Condé Nast, working for Reddit.com, which Wired had just recently purchased, and Style.com, and Epicurious.com, that I found my real footing, which was helping to syndicate amazing content online using digital means. That job, a couple of years later, led to that gig that you mentioned at the New York Times, where I was asked to position the Gray Lady on social media for the first time. And given my experience at Reddit, it seemed natural that they hand this role to a 23-year-old. Okay, so I say that it's a little tongue-in-cheek. It did not actually work that way. Most people didn't know what social media was at the time, so I really lucked out. I was initially the manager of buzz marketing, which is a term that a woman named Leanne Camus at Yahoo, later Google, coined, which stands for word-of-mouth marketing, and that's kind of what I did at Sony. But at the New York Times, what they really wanted was to understand why people were posting articles on Dig and Reddit as opposed to coming to the Times naturally. And they were trying to figure out the Huffington Post at the time. Why do people want aggregated versions of our articles versus the long reads? And so my job there was really amazing. I often say it's the best job I'll ever have. Writing cold emails to ed@twitter.com, jack@twitter.com. Hey guys, I really like your platform. I'm using it in beta. The New York Times is interested in a partnership. What do you think? ? And then getting a response within 30 seconds from the founders of these companies saying, yes, it's my favorite brand in the world. What can we do? I used to keep an email folder where I had screenshot all of the response rates from founders of large tech companies who wrote back to these emails within seconds, because my email address was soraya@nytimes.com, and who wouldn't want the New York Times to ask them to partner? We were the first brand on Facebook, facebook.com/nytimes. I was the first fan, and that led to being the first partner channel on YouTube, the first media company on Twitter alongside CNN. Really a phenomenal experience. But it was at the New York Times that I discovered that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, because we were partnering with exclusively men in hoodies under the age of 30 who seemed to understand something that the women in my division did not, which was how to go to the golf course and raise capital from a venture capitalists, how to form a board, how to put a business plan in front of the right people. And this element of social media intrigued me to no end. So ultimately, I quit my job at the New York Times, to the chagrin of my family and to the devastation of my grandmother, and went to work for one such friend in a product development role, small cloud computing company, which within 6 months, in the speed of the internet, was acquired by Facebook. That time and that experience was invaluable. I went from an ivory tower, or in this case a glass tower in Times Square, working with world-class journalists that have household last names. The way that you can say Oprah or Gwyneth, you can probably say Christoph or Sorkin, and people know who you're speaking about. And these were my contemporaries, my colleagues, and my friends. And to leave that behind to work in what I call a dungeon dev room with 15 boys your age, a keg in the back, a couch that smells like the frat of the founder where he pulled it from, is really a strange experience. And it was there at Drop.io with our stand-up desks and our no meeting policy that I learned what it actually takes to start a startup. Within months, some friends and I in Silicon Valley got together to decide to turn a crazy, audacious idea to bring location-based mapping to the food world with an app called Foodspotting to life. And we raised venture capital for this app from high-profile investors who believed in our crazy vision that when people take photos of food, they might want to upload those photos and create a rating and recommendation system analogous to Yelp or Foursquare. We were the second geolocation mobile social app in the iTunes store. That's called Somolo for anyone that's paying attention. And that experience and that brand was, again, invaluable. Within 2 years, we went from 0 to millions of active users. And my work, again, was in marketing and syndicating that app, Foodspotting, to the masses. We sold Foodspotting to OpenTable. Then Priceline bought OpenTable, and years later, after graduating from Georgetown, lo and behold, I knew what it'd take to start and sell a business. What happened next? At that point, I had some liquidity, which is a fancy way of saying money, and began reinvesting that capital into other businesses that I found promising, many of which were started by women. I guess the colloquial term for what I am now is a venture capitalist. But to summarize my career, what I do is I help businesses get off the ground. Sometimes I found them, sometimes I invest in them, and I advise them on a specific area of expertise: marketing, syndication, growth, storytelling, content leadership, thought leadership, partnership, partnership. You get the idea. And it's this work with startups that I love. It allows me to really work closely with founders that are purpose-driven and purposeful, who have ideas that seem kind of crazy when they're sitting in their living rooms drawing up a business plan, but in fact have the potential to, yes, change the world, which I don't know if you watch Silicon Valley, but it's as cliche as it sounds, and yet when you start drinking the Kool-Aid, you can't stop drinking it. So what does this have to do with the humanities? And I'm, the daughter of a public policy professor, and I have a one-on-one book club with a company I've invested in. The founders, we are tearing through Time's top 100 best novels, because there's a time when you love talking about tech and cap tables and venture valuations and unicorns and unicorpses, and there are times where you just want to sit down with Joan Didion. And I attribute my love for the humanities to Georgetown and to my upbringing.
Wow, what a story. Well, take a breath for a second there. And well, but it's a terrific story and a great story to lay out there, and I appreciate you doing that. The one thing, though, that you could elaborate a little bit on the top of the career there is Zaidi. I mean, because it's not just a normal kind of, okay, let's do something, make an app, make some money, move on. You seem to have some kind of ethical or kind of different way of thinking about that company. So tell us a little bit about that. I think it's important for this conversation.
So I intentionally held off on talking about Zaidi, our baby, because it requires more than just kind of a glib overview. After we sold Foodspotting, I was feeling driven and intent on creating a company that wasn't going to be a flash in the pan, that wasn't going to be a feature that could become an app that could become acqui-hired by somebody else. I really wanted to create a brand and to create a company that had longevity and could resonate with millennials who were seemingly voting with their dollars. So my business partner and I got together and we started talking about why people our age were shopping at Whole Foods and paying premiums to do so, why they were purchasing from brands like Everlane, Tom's Shoes, Warby Parker, and ultimately it's because they aligned so well with the values of the brand. They wanted to vote with their dollars again and become members of a company as opposed to just passive purchasers. And so we said, well, what is the best way to reach this young consumer base using the tools that we understand, digital storytelling and merchandising? And ultimately it was a company, Zaidi, that heralds good things made well, full stop. So on Zaidi, we source and sell beautiful apparel and now make from around the world. And with every item sold, we use our journalistic chops to tell the stories of the providers who make those products. So whether it's a Claire Vivier bag made using sustainable leather from Bologna, produced locally in California, or a Zaidi sweater sourced from wool in Portland, Oregon, at Imperial Ranch Farm, washed in South Carolina, dyed in Pennsylvania, sewn and threaded in Pennsylvania, and ultimately produced in Los Angeles, we really detail every step of the supply chain that matters to consumers. And by giving them ultimately transparency, we're allowing them to feel as though they belong to a brand that promotes and heralds authenticity. So the idea behind Zaidi was to be, again, purposeful and to shine a light on the environmental dangers associated with the production of fashion, to shine a light on how most apparel is made, which is in abysmal conditions at factories far overseas, and then to say there's an alternative, and that alternative is a beautiful garment made well, crafted to last for years, and the best way to actually be sustainable is to buy an item that won't fall apart in 3 washes. So again, Zaidi is a venture-backed business, an online vertically integrated retailer, but what it really is at the end of the day is a brand for a modern conscientious consumer.
Terrific. Now, So the arc of the career there, and again, you still got a long way to go eventually. Um, but
I have
talk.
43 years of career left in me.
But you mentioned this kind of you making the kind of transition into what was, still a very male world, but even of your generational peers. There's a kind of a feeling that, oh, that's the tech world. You got to know tech. You got to know code. And talk a little bit about how easy or hard it was, for that matter, and how, but as a kind of insight to others who, when they hear about startups or tech, they think, oh, I got to know coding or I got to be tech. That so much of what goes on there is really not about tech. It's about other kinds of things that, again, things you can learn in other backgrounds, including the humanities. Talk a little bit about that, if you could.
Sure. So, I mean, in the humanities, you learn how to write and communicate well, which lends itself very neatly to a career as a marketer, because marketing is about storytelling. But to learn how to code is a very different thing. One is sort of a soft skill that could be applied to the business world. The other is a very hard skill that oftentimes pigeonholes you into one department. And so what I've liked about the humanities is it's allowed me to float across disciplines. I can speak about marketing, as I did today, to the founder of a fintech company, and then immediately go and pivot back into the world of fashion and e-commerce and be at home. And that fluidity sits very well with me because I'm a conversationalist and I like learning about people. This again goes back to journalism and wanting to hear stories and relate to people as they tell them. I do think it's pragmatic for every young person in America to learn how to code because we are becoming more of a skill-based society. We're also a 1099 society. 54 million Americans are on 1099s right now, and that's expected to triple in the next 5 years, which means that the majority of Americans are going to be starting their own enterprises. And the best way to ensure success is to be able to have a hard skill that you're able to lend to the company to reduce costs and to mitigate risk. And I now advocate for people to study the humanities. I don't want us to lose our ability to understand Shakespeare and to stop appreciating, beautiful Georgia O'Keeffe's. But at the same time, if you're going to start a company to sell art online, for instance, those Georgia O'Keeffe's, isn't it best if you understand the practical building blocks of how those sites are made? I hope that answers your question.
Did you actually have any background in that? Is that something you've acquired over time? I'd be curious.
So what I do is more project management. I understand how to wireframe. I understand how to design websites and map out what I'd like something to be visually. And then I input those into project management tool websites like Trello or Pivotal. And I know enough about code, very basic code, to make sure that the developers with whom I'm working are producing the end result within time. But this is all self-taught. It was at that cloud computing startup where the gentleman that I worked for said, you have 24 hours to learn how to wireframe. Here's OmniGraffle Pro, now go. And I went home and I Googled, how do you wireframe a website? Which, by the way, is how most things happen at startups. It involves a lot of Googling silly questions you don't want to admit that you have. So yes, I have some pretty tangible hard skills. I also understand what's called growth hacking, the science of marketing, how to yield a great lifetime value of a customer based on a smaller spend, so how to make money through marketing. There's certain sort of tangible skills that are self-taught, but coding websites is not my forte. I leave that to the Princeton Girls Academy, whom I spoke to an hour ago, and their Girls Who Code Club. I'm going to hire them in a couple of years to build my next website.
Do you think now, besides just the appreciation of literature and things like that, do you feel that there's a kind of a set of skills, critical thinking, problem solving, kind of things that are kind of another level up of abstraction, but that still are rooted in what you learn over time, that is also applicable in these more practical situations like startups, for example?
I think that, of course, critical thinking, understanding how to apply thoughtful idea construction to a particular problem is always going to be useful, and the humanities teach that. I will say, though, the best skills for being a founder of a startup are more deeply rooted in things that you can't learn in school. risk assessment, or I don't know, just chutzpah. You can't teach chutzpah, but as an entrepreneur, you need to have it. You need to be able to jump into the deep end of the swimming pool not knowing how cold it will be. You need to really put fear behind you and tackle everything head on as if you're the subject matter expert. Most often you're not, but at startups, it's very much fake it until you make it. And again, these are the types of skills that are required for a successful startup founder. Not necessarily a great leader, but for the person creating the basis or the infrastructure of the company, you need to know how to create your own destiny and follow your own rules. Because often paths are not bulldozed or paved for you. You're creating them as you walk them. But certain humanities-based skills are applicable to startups. And again, being able to write an email effectively, being able to understand people, having a high EQ, I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because when you're asking people to take lower salaries to work for you and to risk their careers on your behalf, you need to empathize with their needs. What's in it for them? And that empathy, I think, came from, for me, a love of literature and a desire to learn more about protagonists in novels and to try to figure out what motivates them to make certain decisions. That kind of training comes back again and again and again. And also at Davos this week, I heard Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, speak, and his company is valued in the multi-billions. He's not just China's greatest entrepreneur of the last century, but maybe one of the most successful entrepreneurs of all time. And he said that the reason for Alibaba's success is that 7 of the founding partners were teachers before they created this company. And he said, my job as a CEO is to be the chief education officer. I'm not only constantly learning, I'm constantly teaching. And if I think of my role in that construct as a teacher, my employees are happier and I'm happier for it.
Fantastic. Well, you made reference there to Davos. I mean, again, it's kind of the peak of kind of global elite society, and there you were whizzing around up there. I mean, so this is really quite a trajectory for you. I mean, when you're up in that space, I mean, again, we're maybe pushing it too far here, but do you feel that the people that you were hanging out with there or connecting with there are the kinds of people who appreciate the humanities, kind of come out of the humanities, are kind of multifaceted, or are kind of, on the other hand, monomaniacal and just kind of focused on what they do well? I'm just curious on your kind of insights, that kind of crew, which is, in many respects, a pretty rarefied group.
So, the question you're asking me is, are folks who attend Davos interested in the humanities, if I can summarize that? And for those who don't know, Davos is a place. It's a small town in Switzerland with really horrible transportation and no Uber to be found. And it hosts an annual summit called the World Economic Forum, which is a lovely but hugely elitist conference for social entrepreneurs, policymakers, and business leaders. And typically, the business leaders are CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, and I was very lucky to attend. As my mother pointed out on Facebook, only 18% of the attendees this year were women, and fewer than that were speakers, so I was feeling very fortunate to speak. But I'm pretty sure I was a token female and token minority on most panels. So it really depends. I mean, actually, you're speaking to me at a funny time. I'm following up with all the business cards I received at Davos. I just got back the day before yesterday. And the business card that I'm holding is from the chairman and CEO of BlackRock. He came up to me at an event and said that he was interested in what I was doing. And did I know what BlackRock was? Because he'd be happy to tell me. They manage $3 trillion. And I stopped him right there and I said, Mr. Fink, I would not be good at what I do if I did not know who you were. But I found it really interesting that he introduced himself, assuming that I didn't know who he was, one of the world's most successful business leaders, and assuming that he would need to promote his entity and to teach me what they're up to. In some ways, that sort of humble and generous behavior I find fascinating and pretty consistent with the leaders that I admire the most. The willingness to try to teach what they do and assume that not everybody is willing to just work with you because you are who you are. as it pertains to an interest in the humanities, I'd say that that's like asking, is America as a country interested in the humanities? It's probably the most diverse group of individuals I've ever been associated with or in community with. Some of them are policymakers again. The Prime Minister of Canada was there. I'm pretty sure he's interested in the humanities from everything that I've read about him, and certainly one of the most empathetic human beings in politics right now. And then, you have Sheryl Sandberg. I've read her book Lean In twice, and she promotes intellectualism and curiosity amongst women. And, in reading what she writes so eloquently on Facebook, and I know she does not use a ghostwriter, she writes that herself, immediately I think, well, this is a woman that grew up reading and writing and understanding the power of the written word. But you also have people with incredible nonprofits. Who don't have skilled business training. Henley Prinsloo of I Am Water, a woman that swims with sharks and whales to promote water advocacy. And she didn't grow up studying marine biology, but it was really just her connection with nature and art that led her to do what she does. So it's a hugely diverse group of people at Davos. And ultimately what the World Economic Forum is promoting is a collective society for the greater good, and it's about making the world a better place through business, through advocacy and philanthropy. These worlds very rarely come together, but what I will say is that it's the smartest group of people that I've ever been in contact with, and synonymously, the smartest people I've ever met in my life tend to be academics, and academics tend to be lifelong learners. So that's the only sort of direct connect the dots I can make about Davos and the humanities. But yes, it is extremely intellectual group of persons.
Look, this is we're taking a lot of your time here, but let me just, as we kind of wind down here, you've kind of made a great case in your own life and kind of the things you've seen here. I mean, that said, as an entrepreneur who thinks through big issues and really rethinks things, and we're called Reinvent. We're all about fundamental reinvention, really rethinking this. Are there any things you'd suggest to the kind of higher education world, the academic world, that you would rethink or redo, or with an appreciation for what you think in the real world out there, either in your education you could have learned from or benefited from, or potentially for future generations here, how they might actually evolve essentially the higher education system, potentially to appreciate more of the humanities, but not exclusively that. In fact, you mentioned the others. We should learn more coding. But any thoughts on how to reform or how to move on?
I believe in hedging your bets. In fact, there's a great book by Adam Grant called Originals, talking about how the most creative people stay creative and how the best entrepreneurs launch businesses. And one of his findings was that successful entrepreneurs tend to hedge. They tend to keep their day job while pursuing a passion. I say the same thing is true about academia. My father was a poet and a philosopher, and yet he ended up in real estate. My mother taught public policy, but she ended up teaching one of the first online classes. And so both of them were intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs at the same time. And so if you think of, the world in not such binary terms, they're the artists over here and the business persons over here, but rather it's good to pursue your passions, and if those are softer subjects as deemed by corporate America, screw it, because it really helps me in the business world to be able to, quote Melville, hopefully not too pretentiously, but it helps me to have a conversation with people about the most recent exhibit at MoMA or my favorite film at Sundance this year. It makes you more relatable and less of a robot. And the last thing people want to do is work with, a quant who went to HBS, who minored and majored in macro and microeconomics and then studied finance, and here they are succeeding in the corporate world. Nobody wants to hang out with that person. But if you understand pragmatic business skills, if you understand what it takes to make a business thrive, and you can kick it with your coworkers and put together an awesome Spotify playlist, now we're talking. So I think that, ultimately the humanities are about pursuing what makes the world special and unique and fascinating, and it's about allowing people to now I'm going to quote Mr. Holland's Opus or something, but it's allowing people to appreciate why the world is special. And if you don't allow people to study arts and humanities, we're ultimately creating a society that cares about the wrong things. But if you study those humanities, you're more likely, as the Girls Who Code Academy just told me an hour ago on Skype, to want to build purposeful companies that actually help society. And so I call that hedging your bets. I say build businesses that have a greater good, but do it with a soft heart at the same time.
That seems about as good a place as any to end what's been a terrific conversation, really helpful, really insightful, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do that and doing it with our partners, your old alma mater, Georgetown. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and Hoi Saxa.